The top of the hour, so welcome everyone to today's third webinar in our online conference, which is The Secrets of WFM, one of my favorite webinars of the year. Delighted to welcome two speakers to join me. Delighted to welcome John Casey, who's well known from the Planning Forum. And John, you've now set up as a contact center consultant in the
I have indeed.
Year or so.
Yeah, I have. So I've set up my own business, just trying to help companies with their planning needs and almost demystify some of the myths that we have.
Wonderful. And we're also delighted to be joined again by Rick Seaver from Genesis. Welcome, Rick.
Hi, it's great to be here.
And you're going to be talking about some of the algorithms that can be used with the increased computing power.
Absolutely, yep. And more importantly, what the increased computing power allows us to do in terms of cool analytics.
Wonderful. So exciting times ahead. Just some reminders: if you want to watch the recording, you can watch that later on already. We're carrying on the discussion in the chat room. You just put in your first name, last name, and you can then download the webinar slides from this bit in here. We are going to be dealing with a lot of detail, and I can pretty well guarantee that that set of slides would be useful for you in looking up some of the references we're talking about, particularly some of the algorithm names. And it's quite useful if you put the chat room to one side of your screen, the webinar slides to the other, and then you can see both parts that are going on there. There's now the advantage: if you have any tips or any questions, you can put those into the chat room. And we have this is our third bottle of Tattanger that's going to be shipped out today, or if you prefer a box of chocolates or a Amazon gift card, we can certainly arrange that. But before we get going, what I want to do is I want to start with a poll, and I'd like to ask, on average, how long do your callers in your contact center wait before they abandon, before they hang up? So is it less than 30 seconds? Is it less than 60 seconds? Is it less than 120 seconds? Or is it more than 121 seconds, so 2 minutes or longer? Or do you not know what the average propensity to abandon in your contact center is? John, any thoughts about where you think it's going to come out?
I probably think it's the 60-120 range. It's usually a bit longer than we expect because obviously some of our customers are a lot more patient, and that can skew the figures.
Well, let's have a look at the results. We've got a sample size of 91 people have voted in this poll. So looks like the most common answer there is actually between 60 and 120 seconds. Surprisingly, only 2% have an average propensity less than 30 seconds. So I guess we've not got a lot of people working in sales centers here. Rick, any surprises for you?
No, I was going to guess exactly the same as John. So no, this looks right. It looks like a normal distribution.
Okay, well, we'll carry the discussion on that in a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a short presentation, and that is going to be what I'm calling the ABC of Erlang. So let me just get this up on the screen here, and hopefully that's happening here. Here we go. So just wanted to share with you a little bit. Been doing a lot of research on Erlang recently, and I want to share a few hints and tips if you're dealing with Erlang. But one of the big things I wanted to run through is there's actually 3 Erlang equations. I think a lot of people know about Erlang B and also about Erlang C, but not a lot of people know about Erlang A. So in historical order, it started with Erlang B, then went on to Erlang C, and then and then we've got another one called Erlang A. So just to take you through, certainly the first Erlang equation was invented by A.K. Erlang, a Danish mathematician, and it worked out the percentage of blocking in a phone system. And certainly in the old days of analog lines, it was quite useful. And it was mainly used to work out how many extra lines more than agents would you require particularly for us in a contact center, which was a very useful formula. But in essence, a quick rule of 20% extra would actually solve it for you. So it's limited use, but the Erlang B formula was very useful in forming the foundations for Erlang C. This here is the actual Erlang C paper, first published in 1917 in the Post Office Electrical Engineers Journal, so now over 100 years old, and a very useful formula. The maths is quite hard, but is actually relatively understandable if you take it through a simple arrangement, and basically works out the probability a call has to wait in a contact center, and it's most commonly used to convert a number of phone calls, an average handle time and a service level, into a number of staff required. It's very robust and is in quite widespread use. And I've put up a link here. Here's an article I wrote, which, funnily enough, turned out to be the most popular new article that was written last year. That it does a step-by-step explanation of the Erlang C formula, in case you want to mug up on your maths. So it explains how this all works. But after Erlang C, there was another formula that can be quite useful, and that's called the Erlang A formula. And the A in Erlang isn't to do with the when it was written. It actually wasn't written by Erlang at all, who died by this stage, but was an extension of the Erlang formula dealing with the number of abandons. It was developed by this mathematician here called Connie Palm in 1946. So this is also well over 70 years old. And it works out the percentage of calls that will abandon based on an average patience time. It's a very useful paper. If you want to go into it, the maths is quite frightening. It took me about 3 months to figure out how it worked. But it works out the number of call abandons. In order to do that, you need to know what the average patience is in your contact center. And a simple way to, simple but takes a while to do, would be to plot out your abandons. And here's an example I took from, this was from a technical support line in a telecoms company I did some work with. And what you do is you get all the call detail records, put them into a spreadsheet and arrange them in time. And then you basically plot out, if you take 100, it's quite 100 abandons, quite easy to do. You work out then every 10% what the average time is for each of those abandons. And that gives you an overall abandon curve. And then you basically read off at the 50% line, and that tells you, in this contact center, it's 1 minute and 40 seconds for the abandons. If you're doing a sales center, that same line would typically come here at about 25 to 30%. So obviously, it depends if you've got a captive audience or not on how long people are prepared to wait. So very useful as a way of working all of that out. Then in terms of one other trick, I think in Erlang, a lot of people tend to forget is maximum occupancy. And one of the things that when you're doing an Erlang calculation, you need to do is to make sure your occupancy doesn't go above 85%. Because if you go above 85% occupancy, a number of things will happen. First is that people don't get a chance to have a break before calls. So two things happen. You increase your burnout, and you'll lead to increased attrition and absent rates that are accompanied with burnout. But what you also probably find out is that agents pick up undesirable habits on calls. So for instance, they'll put people on hold in order to give themselves thinking time, or even just to go off and get a break. And what you'll often find is that if you have occupancy over 85%, you'll often find that that's actually hidden in your average handling time, which will increase. So very important that you build in the occupancy into that. And so if you want to, simple way to deal with all of these is use the Erlang calculator on Call Center Helper. We cover all of these different areas So you can put in an average patients into it, which pulls in the Erlang A formula, pulls out the maximum occupancy, and it gives you overall results. So these number of agents is based on Erlang C, the abandon rate based on Erlang A, and it will tell you at what point you can go above the occupancy figures. So that's just a sort of quick little secret of Erlang for you. That's the ABC of Erlang. So hopefully it's quite useful for you. So right, what we're now going to do is we're now going to go across, and I think we've got another poll for you. And the poll that we're going to ask is, what do you find it most difficult to forecast? Do you find it's phone calls? Do you find it's live chat? Do you find it volatility or seasonal trends? Do you find it just forecast staffing levels, or is it back office work? So what do you find it most difficult to forecast? Rick, where do you think the answer is going to come with this?
I think it's going to be back office work, only because we have good data on everything else. Back office is something that people struggle to get decent data on. That's my guess. Okay, well, let's have a look. And perhaps since we're talking about the secrets, it's not a surprise that guess is right. It's good we've got great experts here. 48% back office work, 25% staffing levels, 18% volatility or seasonal trends, and 5% live chat. So I know live chat's a headache for a lot of people. And John, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's one of the topics you were talking about in your presentation.
It is indeed, John. You're going to spend a few slides just talking about some of the challenges around web chat and a few of the tips to actually forecast it better.
Indeed. Well, probably now is a good time as any to hand that across to you. And
okay,
you'd like to put your slides up on the screen?
Let me just check which screen I'm about to show.
There we are.
Brilliant. So, thanks, John. Let me just get rid of the cameras so I can click a mouse and move the slides. So, just an introduction, as you said earlier, John, I've set up my own planning, and as I was saying, one of the things is actually bringing resource planning, making it real, getting rid of some of the myths and helping businesses with that. And I think that leads very nicely to probably when anybody asks me about WFM resource planning or anything like that, what's the next big thing? I keep coming back to this Back to the Future analogy and say, well, actually, what we need to do is actually go back to some of the basics, go back to what you were chatting about, Jonty, in those first few slides. With Erlang C, do we really understand it? Do we understand some of those interdependencies? Because I think all too often we're looking for the techie, the great solutions that are out there, but that basic understanding of some of the key principles underpins anything we want to do. And as this little model shows, some things have never changed. I mean, the planning cycle really is forecasting. Let's predict what's going to happen. Let's ask yourself that very basic question. Why did anybody get out of bed this morning and decide they were going to phone our centre? They must have a problem, and do we truly know what those problems are or what's going on in the world? And we'll just come back to that maybe in a couple of slides' time. Then, as your little poll talked about the difficulties around scheduling just before we started and some of those key challenges, can we get that plan right to deal with that customer expectation? Monitoring the real time, what's going on in the world. I'm going to have a little slide just with a couple of key tips on this as we go through now in the next few minutes. But really watching and really understanding what's happening, not just being able to repeat core numbers, but what is going on to cause those numbers. And then stepping back, getting that time to understand what happened with that plan, what could we do different, and what do we need to try as we move forward. It's been around probably for the 20+ years I've been in planning, and I think that is a real good set of questions to constantly ask ourselves with respect to WFM and resource planning. So I suppose the big one is we always hear it, especially from operations, especially from stakeholders, but the plan was wrong. And of course it is. By very definition, a lot of our forecasting is wrong before it begins. Things happen, agents phone in sick, planning fails. And it's always worth just understanding what that means. And I think to start with forecasting, the biggest reason I think for forecasts to go wrong, and if you look at the little spike in the middle of that graph, often it goes way out. But even with some of them on the right-hand side of the graph, an upper, a middle, a lower, and I know Rick's going to talk a lot about forecasting scenarios, and I won't steal his thunder, but we've got to prepare for what might happen. Those of us in the UK and Europe know how volatile things are at the moment with the Brexit discussions and the uncertainty about when it might actually happen. So any of our forecasts are going to have that uncertainty in it, and we need to be prepared. We need to understand what's going on. I mean, I've been doing and chatting to some good friends and companies like Eurostar, companies like Thomas Cook, the airlines, even EasyJet came out in the news yesterday about how sales are just flatlining, bottoming out because of uncertainty. And if we had run a forecast 3-6 months ago, would we have been thinking about this possible uncertainty and doing that upper, middle and bottom, saying, well, if this happens in the world, if that happens in the world, will that change why customers want to call us? Moving on to schedules, and going back to that little discussion just as we kicked off, it's always interesting to hear the challenges. And I think now more than ever, with demographics changing in our workforce, that first question, do we understand what our staff want? I mean, there's a lot of discussion around gig economy, 0-hour contracts, etc., etc. And actually, one big thing we started to notice with recruitment is actually sometimes now people don't want full-time hours. It interferes with their life. It interferes with other things they want to do. And there's more and more of a workforce perhaps looking for, give me a baseline, give me 25, give me 30 hours. But if I'm at the loose end next week, I'll gladly do an extra shift. But we pocket people into this 35, 40-hour full-time week. And is that what our staff want? So therefore, when they find another job, perhaps not necessarily in the industry, but somewhere else, similar wages, maybe slightly better, but offering them some of that lifestyle, the hours or the flexibility, is that leading to some of our attrition? So we do need to understand our staff, and we do need to understand our customers. Are we open when they need to be, when they expect us to be open? Why do we have those spikes? Why do we have those drops during the day? And I think with scheduling, it's not just relying on the software to give us the graphs, to give us the numbers, but it's going back and actually asking ourselves those questions. Is that will allow us to manipulate some of the data and better plan going forward? Just moving on to real time. One thing I've always said is, when should we hold our nerve? It's great to see them that, you know, we see 20 calls waiting, and we say, well, we better do something, cancel breaks, cancel training, do this, do that, because if somebody sees that, there'll be a panic, they'll be shouting. But sometimes we planned that. We planned to be busy. We planned, we knew we were short on staff. That's exactly what was in there. So sometimes we just have to hold it. We know that when the next group comes back from a break, it'll settle down. So I'm not saying we don't do real time and we don't react, but it's knowing when we need to react and when we need to perhaps step back and take a deep breath and say, let's give it 3 or 5 or 10 minutes more, and then we'll put our emergency plan into place. And then the final part of that is the proper review. Do we have time to analyse? And more importantly, can we analyse without bias? You know, all too often I hear someone say, we were busy yesterday because, and we run with it, we run with assumptions. But I do a lot of work with Ulster University and working with students doing a degree. And one of the things we're always telling them is remove bias, step back, let's get underneath it. It's okay to make an assumption, but don't go looking for that. And I think all too often we say, oh, well, we were busy yesterday because we had a little bit of sickness. but maybe that was just a sickness we had planned, or maybe we had lower holidays and we overlooked the fact. So we do need to step back when we're reviewing, and we do need to have a very, very open mind. And one thing I always think we miss, and it's probably one of the big tips for planners, is averages. They are our worst enemy. And we all know, and we all learn the lesson of weighted averages very, very early on. And there's a great article up on the Call Center Helper website, which I've stolen these graphs from just because they tell the story. We often assume that this magic bell curve exists around our averages, around our average handle times, and we use a figure down the middle. But really, if you look at the graph at the bottom and you apply that to your volumes for yesterday, last week, last month, what you do find is we have loads and loads and loads of very short calls. And as I learned in my last project with a retail company, for every 10, 60-second or 120-second call, there was always one that was 15, 30, 60 minutes long because the customer had such a severe issue. And what you've got to start looking at is actually graphing it differently and saying, no, it's not. But actually, can we identify what type of call is those 1 minute, 2 minutes? What type of call is those 60 minutes? And go back, why did somebody want to call us today? Is there something happening that will make those short calls more frequent, those long calls more frequent, and move that dotted line, that average, based on the calls we expect? Not just this, oh, what calls are random. Because actually, if we step back and think, I don't think that's entirely true. Calls are random, but there are trends out there, and there will be things going on. Newspaper ads, radio ads, stories about competitors that brings them in a different way. Moving on, and as I said just before I started, was we were looking at the last survey, web chat, I think it was about 6%, if I remember correctly, said that it was a difficulty planning for web chat. Well, I also think as we look forward, web chat is becoming a channel of choice for many of our customers, and I think there's a lot of common mistakes a lot of us make as we transition to that. I just want to go over some of the misconceptions in the next couple of slides. And the first one is concurrency. One thing, and it'll come up again just as I speak coming through, is we often say, well, it's 300 calls tomorrow. Every agent can have 3 open, so they could do. So if you divide that by 3, that gives us a volume of 100, and that's use Erlang. And of course, now I've just spotted a typo where it say we can just use, it should say we can't just use an Erlang calculator. So quite an important one, because what we do know, especially with concurrency, is it grows and it dies off during the day. We rarely have it when we switch on that we would have 3 or 4 per agent available and waiting for us. And suddenly at the end of the day, we have to die off as we try to scale down and finish those shifts. And I'll come back to that in a second. But maybe one of the biggest, and I've actually seen this with a courier company recently where I was expecting my kid's Mother's Day present to arrive for Sunday. And I was tracking it. And literally every time since Thursday that we looked in, we get this message, we're not available right now, try later. And a lot of us do this with web chat. We actually say, well, if our agents can't take any more, switch off the software. Okay, for customer expectation, it makes a lot of sense, something we can't do on the phones. But for forecasting, how do we ever know our true volume? If we don't just let it organically arrive, we'll never know the volume, which potentially means we will always be short scheduling, we'll always be understaffing. So we're always behind the curve, so we're not moving customers over to web chat if that's their channel of choice. Another key fact is average handle time. Average handle time does change based on your concurrent interactions. And if you just look at the bottom, I've just done 2. The first one is just showing a typical interaction, the agent or the frontline associate chatting, and then waiting for the customer to type their response, then back to that frontline agent, back to the customer, and so on. And it takes a period of time, 5 or 6 twos and fro's to do it. Then suddenly, the agent takes a second one, and what happened? Two customers finish typing at the same time, but the agent, multitasking experts or not, can still only physically type back to one of them. So what you see arriving is that little yellow box, the queuing. So now we're putting queues within the interactions as well as queues before the interactions. So if you would add up the blue and the green for that top interaction, it's identical to the first example. But suddenly we've added 10, 15, 20% to that customer interaction time. To be honest, the customer probably doesn't realize. The customer's probably as satisfied as they would have been. But what we're seeing now is just by doubling the interactions, we add to it. If we then take a third one, it's entirely possible that the agent has 3 customers finishing a response within a matter of seconds and 2 of them queuing within the interaction. Now, there's customer experience in that and how long that pause may be. It can be tailored by jumping over and say, I'll be with you in a second, or doing that kind of messaging. But we've got to take that into account when we look at AHTs. How many interactions are our customers likely to be having? And how do we build that into our model? And I'll come back to that. And it ties in with Markov's birth death syndrome. Again, another model that's been around for a long, long time. It's been developed by others. And if you just look at the model on the right, when an agent comes on shift, they won't have an interaction exactly the same as with inbound calls, as with back office, whatever. But then the next interaction comes in. Whilst they're on that, they may stay on one for the entire interaction. They may lose the customer and go back to 0. They will lose the customer at some point, or a second action can come in and they go to 2. A third one could come in and they go to 3, and so on until whatever cap you've set as a business, and they can go backwards. Thinking of that previous slide with the interactions, that means their AHT is volatile. Even for the same thing, depending on where they are in that 0, 1, 2, 3, their AHT may be going up, or if they're losing customers, is coming down. It also means we have to plan that when we open, if we're not open 24/7, we have to build up momentum and assume that when the team first goes on, they'll be in the lower AHTs. And we also have to think about, well, it's my break in 10 minutes. At what point do I go from 3 to 2 to 1? And can the software let me do that so that when my break comes up within a few minutes, I'm on 0? Moving on, and maybe tying in with Jonty's Erlang A example, tolerance does have a very different impact. And on the whole, tolerance or patience, just different words for the same thing. Kaplan-Meier have done a lot of analysis around survival analysis and the chances of people still being around. If you Google it, you do see a lot of medical stuff and survival in the terminal concept, but it actually applies looking at some of the inputs going into it. People are normally more tolerant. I know I would sit with it on the other screen and I will wait a lot longer for a web chat because I can get on with my work, I can get on with whatever I'm doing and wait for that response coming. So you do need to think about that patience, and probably it's exponentially higher when we get to web chat and build that into our modeling. Just to finish off, a couple of slides on omnichannel. As web chat obviously is part of it, but it is one of the buzzes we've been looking at for the last year or two. And the little graph on the right does talk about still a lot of us are still in that early implementation. We think we need it. We are looking at what channels. But there's a great book by Bill Price. Bill Price did a lot of work with the Amazon, and we all know the Amazon experience and how smooth it can be. What he was saying is the traditional B2B, business to business and business to consumer, is actually dying, and we have to change it around. And the big one now is C2B, or consumer to business, which is basically saying, I will tell you what channel I want you to be on and when I want you to be there. So if we think you should be on Facebook and you're not on Facebook, we'll go to a competitor. If we think you should be on Instagram or in web chat or email service, then we will go to people who offer that to almost to suit our life and to give it the way we want. But the big issue with this is don't assume it's efficiencies. I've done a lot of work with several companies. Many years ago, when our local health service, the NHS in the UK, moved to an app saying, well, that's what people want. They want to do it on their phone. They estimated 30–40% call deflection. They actually ended up with about 1% because it wasn't the right channel. It was great, but people still wanted to talk to a human being. And what I've seen with travel companies and with others is sometimes new channels doesn't deflect out of voice. It doesn't move people to these concurrent channels. It just allows your customer to contact you for even more reasons. The best example I heard from a travel company was nobody's ever going to phone up and ask you how far is the local supermarket from a hotel, but they'll certainly sit on a Sunday afternoon with the laptop on their knee and ask that type of question because the cost of their time is low. They don't have to sit in a call. They don't feel like it's a silly or irrelevant question to be asking somebody face to face. So what we often see is every new channel doesn't move our calls, it just increases our overall volume. So that's myself. Hopefully you all get some interesting or some new facts out of that and find it useful.
Thank you very much for that, John. Some great secrets there. Certainly unrealistic forecasts. We need to prepare for what might happen. I think we are very guilty of following the number, not
John,
following the
you're
variance in
sharing your
numbers.
wrong screen.
Oh, wrong screen. Okay. So yeah, we need to be very careful of following the number rather than the range of numbers. Scheduling, do we understand what our staff want? Don't fall into the trap of assuming everyone's full time. Watch out with average handling time. Don't get caught with the average of averages. I like some of the academic research there. Markov actually published his theory of probabilities in 1880, so an even older theory than the Erlang one. So it's amazing how forward-thinking some of these people are. And the Kaplan-Meier, I've not read that one. I'm going to be going off to the library getting a paper on that. And finally, don't assume that omnichannel brings staffing efficiencies. So some great pieces there. Right, the chat room is absolutely humming. So the first question Leaf has asked is, what's most used today? Is it a service level of, say, 80% in a number of seconds? Or are people now starting to use average speed of answer as a service level? Rick, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this?
Oh, no, I think people are still using service level as their go-to. I personally, depending upon what kind of business you are, I really like abundance as a goal. Because it's really it's where the rubber meets the road. It's your customers walking out on you in effect. But I think overwhelmingly people are still using service level, 80% and something.
Yeah, I think that's certainly abundance is a good one because there's service design in that. Andrea asked, how do we schedule for both inbound and outbound calls? John, you talked about multi-channel. Any pointers on how to do this?
I think this ties nicely to the efficiency one. Because once we do outbound, we avoid calls coming in. We actually need to keep that maximum occupancy even lower than 85%. Probably when you get to blended with inbound and outbound, particularly if inbound is important not to miss, you're probably looking at capping towards the low 70s. Probably always good to have a few people either dedicated to one or the other. So that you can keep the inbounds moving, because if you get a lull, you can easily put all your agents, flip them onto the dialer, and suddenly can't take that next wave of inbound calls. But I think the big one on that is it's seen as, well, let's blend them, let's do it less expensively, but maybe going for that ultimate 85 in a blended does cost you in the end.
Rick, have you done any modeling of inbound outbound?
Yeah, it's really an interesting problem because it's a situation where there is no requirement. So the whole concept of staffing to a requirement for outbound doesn't make a lot of sense. What you want to staff to instead is you want to look at, by time of day, the probability that people will pick up the phone. So for example, if you have a collection shop, what you want to look at is basically a graph of when your customers will actually answer the phone, what the contact rates are, and schedule around those.
Indeed, and it's quite interesting also looking at when is the best time to make an outbound call, because you're actually aiming to keep people when they're in. So there is a window of after work for some people. There's also quite an interesting one of actually looking through contact history. When did they contact you? That tends to indicate their time they're most receptive for doing that. So here's a comment from Brett, who says our service level is 80% answered in 60 seconds. We changed it from 80-20 3 years ago. It was based on a review of several data points, some key ones: time to abandon, customers holding on for longer. A survey found they were happy to wait for longer, and research suggested first contact resolution was more important than time to answer. So as satisfaction factors were not being impacted by this, it made sense to take the pressure off resource and focus on first contact resolution as part of an environment change. We found the change positive and saw no negative impact in customer satisfaction. In fact, it was slightly up. John, I like that.
It is, and actually going back operationally and looking at what's happening, I think one thing I've realized is the traditional 80-20, it's probably more there for our workforce management systems because they need the inputs than it actually means anything. I mean, one mantra I have is we've probably mistrained the public into the fact that they have to wait when they phone us. So 20 seconds they don't expect. What they do want is answered and what they believe is timely. That'll change, but actually when they get through, they don't have to call back. And that probably outweighs any need to answer that call in a few seconds.
And here's an interesting question from Amber. I'm not sure what's driving this. What are your thoughts on introducing a secondary service level? For example, meeting the 80-120 SLA, but adding an additional SLA target that meets the average speed of answer goal. Therefore, if only 20% are answered within 80 and 120, ensure that 80% are answered within another SLA. What are your thoughts on that? Rick, I don't know if you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have seen this once or twice before, but it's mostly around I'll make it up, 80-20 is their staffing goal, but they also have a secondary goal, which is 100, I don't know, 60 or something like that. So they basically put themselves, and maybe this is more for back office work, but the idea of having two goals is interesting, and it certainly is something that management should, can strive for. But it doesn't help you with your scheduling and your staffing, because you do actually need something to some goal to figure out how many people you need.
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges overall there is potentially, maybe just if you're understaffed, then changing the service level target doesn't necessarily solve that, and maybe the approach is not on whether the target's right, but actually the discussion with senior management to get more staffing into the place. Right, good time to jump across to Rick. And Rick, we're going to be looking at what increased computing power is doing in terms of workforce management.
Awesome. All righty, so let me know when you can see my screen here. Let me pop this up.
There we are.
Okay, great. Okay, hold on, I gotta do one more thing here. Right.
There.
All right, here we go. Okay, great. All right, well, first off, before I get started, I do want to thank you all for taking time to chat with us this afternoon. Of course, I always love chatting with John T, and Rachel's great, and I was really interested in your slides, John. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of there's been a sort of a sea change. You've heard vendors talking about going to the cloud and how cool that is and how important that is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of walk you through some of the things that cloud enables. So, in terms of algorithms. So let me just go ahead and walk you through. There's basically three types of algorithms that are in either a planning system or a workforce management tool. There's the kinds of algorithms that help us forecast, predictive models. They help us forecast the future volumes and handle times, and for planning sick time and those sorts of things. There's something called descriptive models, which describe an operation, and these are your Erlang C calculations or your simulation models. But basically what they do is they say, if I had this volume, how many people would I need in order to hit whatever service goals I have? And then you have the third type of model, which are called prescriptive models, which prescribe a solution. Basically what they say is, given that I have this requirement, say, how many people do I need to schedule at which time of the day and what their schedule should be, or if I'm putting together planning, a long-term plan, when should I hire the people and when should I offer overtime and those sorts of things. So these three types of models work together. But the one thing that's interesting is that this whole cloud computing model had sort of an unintended consequence, which was to make all of these models better and faster and allow us to do more things. So I would expect that, Genesis certainly is, but I would expect all the other vendors are also investing in cloud-based, and you hear AI all the time, but AI-driven algorithms. What these things allow us to do is it allows us to have these three different types of models be fast, be provably accurate, and for scheduling and long-term planning, it allows us to be optimal. In other words, come up with the very best solutions. But here's the coolest thing about cloud computing. It also allows us to solve all of these things in parallel, which means instead of solving one schedule and it taking, nowadays in the cloud, it could take 5 minutes to solve a schedule, say, I can actually send up 100 schedules to run at the same time in parallel and have them all come back in 5 minutes. Now think about what that allows us to do. What it does is it enables a whole new class of contact center analytics. So let's talk about, I'm going to talk about each one of those different types of models. It can be a little confusing because people can confuse forecasting with requirements and those sorts of things. So it's great, we're fast, accurate, and optimal, so what? So let's talk about some of the types of things we can do. The first type is, this is a model, a use of a simulation model, which is a replacement for your Erlang C calculation, say. And what this does is it allows us to do, run a whole bunch of data points at the same time. So if we have this accurate simulation model, or this accurate Erlang model, say, what we can do is we can actually take that model out for a spin, and I can run it a whole bunch of different times. In this example, I'm varying my agents, the number of agents I have, on the x-axis, and I'm keeping track of my service level on the y-axis. So what I have the ability to do is say, if this little circle is where I am in my plan or how many people I have, if I were to add 10 people, what would happen to service level? If I were to add another 10 people, what would happen to service level? Another 10 people, what would happen to service level? So you can see how I can vary the number of agents I have and see what happens to service level. That's really cool. But again, this is something I can solve really, really quickly because I can run them in parallel. Let me show you where this gets really neat. What I'm doing here is I'm plotting another sensitivity analysis graph where I am plotting service level on the x-axis. I'm adding people to increase my service level here, and I'm keeping track of their costs and the cost per contact. So not only can I look at the, how I fluctuate the number of people to get new service levels, I can actually fluctuate service level by adding people and seeing what happens to my cost. So it shows here in this example that a 90% service level, I've got dollars here on the y-axis, will cost me $4.90 a call, where 70% service level will cost me $4.50. You can see how important this is when you're trying to figure out what your service level goals should actually be. It's one of the ingredients to the decision that people tend to forget, which is it's neat to know what our patience is and everything, but we should also know what the cost of the different service goals are. In sales centers, you have another dimension, which is I'm plotting here on the x-axis my service level, and on the y-axis I'm keeping track of the profitability of that center. And what you can see is if I'm way here to the right, if I'm running a 90% service level, it means that my agents are too idle and they're not selling enough stuff to pay for themselves on the margin. On the, if I'm over here on the left-hand side, it says that I'm leaving money on the table I can staff up and I'd make a lot of money. And where I would like to run my service level is somewhere up here at the top in this example around a 70, 75, to 80 or 78% service level or something like this. So I'm running a sales center. I can actually draw the profit versus my service level goal, and this should be my goal if it was a sales center. So that's neat. Okay, next thing, I'm changing sort of direction here. Let's talk about goals. We have, every once in a while I get to chat with senior executives at call centers, and I ask them what their, the number one thing they worry about, what are their goals. Number one is always net promoter score or happy customers or some sort of thing. First call resolution is high on their list. They want to answer the phone quickly if they can. But here's an interesting thing is they also want to have low variability of service delivery. In other words, having a great average service level is fine, but having high service levels and low service levels and having them average out to a good number is not fine. You want to have service consistency. They want to have happy employees. They want to have a lot of sales. All these things are things that bosses want. They have a whole ton of goals, but the interesting thing is that all of our workforce management systems typically worry about one thing, and that's service level only. You enter a service level goal, and that drives the rest of the process. When in fact, the thing that the bosses care about more are things that are different. So if our algorithms are fast, accurate, and optimal, we can run them in parallel. What we can do is we can actually start looking at solving these other objectives too. So that, again, this is one of the things that's kind of cool that is going to be coming because we have speed and cloud computing. So what I'm going to do is I have here on this graph. This is I'm going to show you something kind of. This is not brand spanking new. This is not something I developed. Something that I actually took a class on in college a long time ago. What I have here is two different objectives: agent preference, which is what percentage of agents get their first pick in shifts, versus service level on the y-axis. And I could actually run my scheduling algorithms so that I schedule them for the different objectives. So I can actually say, okay, if I were to maximize the number of agents that get their preference, forgetting service level altogether, you might have this data point up here, which 100% of my agents work when they want to, but they have very low service levels. Do note that this is a made-up graph. I'm not using real data here. On the other hand, I could say, okay, I'm going to maximize the service level, give it, and see what service level would I achieve. And this example, you're never going to get to 100% service level, but I'm going to be very high on service level, and I might be very low on agent preference. But if I have the ability to run these two different objectives at the same time within my scheduling algorithm, which cloud computing enables, I could actually give weights to those two different objectives. And I could say, let's assume that I want to give my agents to an 80% preference to agent preference and a 20% preference to service level, and I might get a data point like this. Or I could run it 50-50 and get a data point like this. Or I can run it the other way, 20-80, and get a data point like this. And what you end up with is a curve. And this curve is actually, there's a name for it. It's called the Pareto Frontier. And each point is considered part of the non-inferior set. And what that means is, in order for me to improve one of my objectives and move along this curve, I have to actually get worse on the other objective. So this curve represents something very significant. All of the points on this line is optimal for some combination of those two different objectives. And so what you would like to do is, if these were my two objectives, what you'd like to do is take this graph, walk up to your decision maker, the people, and say, here's service level versus agent preference. Where would you like to be on this curve? And I'll create schedules that get us on this curve. Or you could add those other objectives too, like minimizing my cost or maximizing my net promoter score, or things like that are things that we're going to be able to add into our scheduling algorithms and draw the curves associated with them. So that's really cool. This is a different way of looking at scheduling, and scheduling for things other than just service level. All right, the next thing. A long time ago, I was working at an airline, and I was producing schedules for the airline, and they were in a negotiation with the union. And of course, since I built these scheduling algorithms a long time ago, one of the things that they asked me is, let's start evaluating the cost of all of these different work rules that we have. So one of the things, again, that you can do with a scheduling algorithm, if you have cloud computing and parallel processing, is I can actually run them with the constraints on and off. So for example, I might want to start my shifts at 15 minutes or 30 minutes, but I can actually relax those and say, you know what, if I ran them at the hourly level or the 30-minute level or the 15-minute level, how would that affect my service level, my sales, my cost, my agent preference scores, all these things. And I can run them all at the same time and bring them all back and look at them all at the same time, as opposed to waiting for one scheduling run to happen. Same thing with allowing rotating shifts or not allowing them. And I made up some constraints here, but whatever your constraints are, I can run them with them on and run them with them off. And at the same time, it takes me to run one schedule, because I have parallel computing, I can run 50 of them with all these different constraints being analyzed. So it allows you to sort of figure out what the cost of your work rules are. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is, again, a different kind of model. This is a forecasting model. So let's talk about forecast risk. Especially, I love that you guys were chatting about how Brexit is sort of bringing a lot of uncertainty into your operations. Well, that's true. And of course, one of the places that we always see forecasts, and more importantly, forecast uncertainty, is when hurricanes are about to hit. So, take a look at this graph. We're going to see something like it coming down the road here. All right. So one of the things that we've been able to do and I've seen other vendors doing this as well, because of cloud computing again, and because there's all these folks who are talking about AI forecasters, and that's great. We've got one now that we've just rolled out, and like I said, the other vendors have them too. And what you can do is you can actually send data up to the cloud. You can have the forecaster figure out, fill in all of your missing data points. They can look for outliers, like John was showing you an outlier, and smooth the outliers out. They can figure out which methods they should be using, and they can crank through a whole bunch, hundreds of thousands of different forecasts, and bring you back the one that's the best, which is what we have here, which is I have a forecast, and then on the right-hand side I have data, and then on the right-hand side I have the forecast, which is, based upon the math, the best. But because I can do this fast and because I can do it in parallel, I can also run and figure out what the second best one is. And then I can figure out what the third best one is. And then I can figure out what the fourth best one is, fifth best one is, and then I can start drawing something that looks a lot like that hurricane graph, which is, here are all the forecasts that are considered good based upon the mathematics associated with my data. So I run through a whole bunch of different techniques. I run hundreds of thousands of different forecasts, and I can show you the best 20 if I'd like, which makes me able to do things like this, which is develop a sort of a hurricane cone of our forecasts, especially at times like today in the UK, when there's a lot of uncertainty in your business. So what's neat about this is this gives us a different way of looking at forecasts. I can draw the 90% cone, I can draw the 50% cone, the 80% cone, you can draw all of them. But what's neat is you can start changing the conversation to be around the uncertainty of our forecast, just based upon the uncertainty of our business. And that is all I really had here. But the idea here is that cloud computing is speeding things up. We have in the olden days, we used to have to take a lot of shortcuts to build algorithms in order to get them to work on our slower computers. Nowadays, we have infinite computing capability, which means that we can run them fast, and therefore they become more accurate. When we run our schedulers now, we can use true optimization to do it and come up with the absolute best set of schedules, or for long-term planning, the absolute best set of hiring plans and those sorts of things. So we can come up with the very best plans, fast, accurate, optimality, and now that we have parallel computing, we can do all these sorts of analyses that we haven't been able to do before. And Jonty, that's all I had. I think questions, and that's it, guys.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Rick. Some great insights there. Prescriptive models look at the effects of relaxing constraints, particularly comparing those against each other. Look at not just the forecast, but also the forecast ranges, some of the computing. And then and you've got a range of forecasts, perhaps that 90% probability, change the conversation towards how we deal with that uncertainty, I think, is some great things. If you'd like to see a demonstration of the Genesis technology on workforce management there, then or any of there's a range of different products there. I'm sure Rick will be able to arrange that for you. So if you'd like to see a demonstration of some of that live in working, now is the time to do that. And then we're going to go off and have a look at some of the top tips and questions that have come through. Just going to run it through a couple of quick ones here. Nicole has asked the question, curious to know if anyone else includes IVR volume and response time in your overall service level calculation. John, I don't know if you've seen.
Yeah, I'm just not 100% sure, but I think what the key is when you start counting it. And what I would always feel, it's only when an agent is able to answer it. So sometimes we have very long IVRs and we have the choice for people to get self-served within it. And I wouldn't normally count those because service level is really the speed of answer of our frontline staff.
One of the things I've seen with the IVR that a lot of people forget to do is in terms of measuring abandon rates. There was one car repair company that were absolutely staggered to find they had an 18% abandon rate in their IVR. And they only measured their abandon rate was actually only after calls left the IVR and queued for an advisor. So that would certainly be one of the things that I would suggest you have a look at. Rick, I don't know if you've got any ideas. Have you got any stats on the costs of omnichannel if contacts increase instead of decrease, then offering self-service potentially wouldn't decrease call volume.
I know. I think you're right. I don't know what the costs actually are, but and John had talked about. I think was there a 20%? No. I'm confusing two different slides. No, but it's something that we all sort of know now, which is when we first started this stuff, we'd say, hey, we're going to offer chat, and our volumes are going to go way down, and therefore we're going to save a lot of money. But I think everybody sort of knows now that that's not the case. The more channels you get, the more channels people use, and the costs certainly do increase.
And it's quite interesting. Quite interesting. Self-service seems to be reducing overall contact volumes, but because all the simple stuff's now taken offline, the contacts are actually becoming more complicated. A lot of the research, we're going to be talking through this tomorrow, is actually it's a sort of net. What you lose in contacts gets taken up in Slack in call durations. So overall, roughly the same number of advisors are needed, if not more. Richard's tip here: we have an annualized hours team. We've seen a reduction in overtime costs to handle peak times. Annualized team work long shifts during busy periods, which mean no additional cost to staff up, plus less agent idle time mid-month to mid-afternoon when we're quiet, as this team only work a short day or not at all. John, I know you've talked on banked hours or annual hours before in the past.
Yeah, I think it's one of these. It's a great solution for some people, and for others, it's just totally impractical. I think you have to look at the volatility of your arrivals. Do you have those unexpected spikes, or do you have some significant seasonality? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you're then buying the hours back and actually having the cost later in the year. So if you're relatively stable, it's not as great a solution, but if you have these moments of madness or these days in the month or something like that, it can be really good as long as you can identify upfront time where you're likely to pay it back.
Yeah, certainly I've seen a number of people who've put it in, and it's great for people to bank the hours, but then when it comes to spending them, that's actually also at a busy period. So
and then you causes a lot of etc.
So Rick, here's one here about make sure you have the correct calculation of shrinkage. It has a larger impact, as if you don't have this correct, you're more likely to have failure.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of folks use spreadsheets for their longer term plans, and I have seen so many times where this has been miscalculated. Sometimes they have the denominator and numerator wrong, and yeah, no, this is a very important tip for those of you who do your long-term planning in a spreadsheet, because it can lead to significant understaffing or overstaffing. It's a huge thing. And another tip, sort of a corollary to this, which is, again, for your longer-term plans, your capacity plans, you definitely want to forecast those things that make sense to forecast, like agent sick time or agent attrition. Those are items that are usually by location, not necessarily across a nation, nationwide sort of view, but by location, those are things that are usually pretty forecastable. There's usually seasonal peaks and valleys associated with your agent's shrinkage. So it's important to calculate it right, but it's also important to forecast it.
Indeed, and shrinkage is one of those ones that when you put it on a spreadsheet and try and break it down into the individual components, always seems to come in much lower than actually what you observe in practice. Though I don't know if there's a sort of like an unknown shrinkage rule of thumb on there, but it always seems to be about 10% different. John?
Yeah. I think there's just this, that there's agent behavior on the day, which we never put in the calculation, but we know they vanish, or that something happens, or somebody logs people as going home as a half day, but they actually left about 11:30 because they were sick, and we do lots of roundings on the day, and it just underestimates by the end of it.
Indeed. Well, unfortunately, that's the end of the webinar. If you'd like to put in the chat room what you liked best about today's webinar. Today's winning tip comes from Richard29, who says, commit to a daily meeting with managers to discuss forecast and planning so that if the unexpected happens, it doesn't come as a surprise. make management aware of absence levels, overplan shrinkage, also the potential to change offline time, etc. I guess that's one of those things that if you're going into an area of uncertainty, after a number of days, you'll start to see the pattern and can actually plan according to that. So Richard will be in touch with you about your prize. We do have a little survey when you're leaving, and we'll be back tomorrow morning looking at the shape of the contact center industry in 2020 and beyond. So there's still time to look onto that. Just like to thank our two speakers. John Casey, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, John T. Really enjoyed it.
And Rick, thanks for having you back as well.
Of course, anytime.
Wonderful. And we'll see you all tomorrow morning at 10:30 when we get into day 2 of the Conference. Thanks and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.